Welcome to Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Force. I'm Jeff Nichols, the president and CEO. It's so happy to have you here tonight for this very important topic and discussion. And this program is called Multiplied Testimony, Multiplied Views, the Contested Legacies of Historical Monuments. And it's part of our ongoing Salon series. So in 1823, Thomas Jefferson wrote, multiplied testimony, multiplied views, will be necessary to give solid establishment to the truth. Much is known to one which is not known to another, and no one knows everything. It is the sum of individual knowledge which is to make up the whole truth, and to give its correct current through future time. So our Salon series was developed to offer a place for people to discuss their differences of opinion in an open and civil way, and to help to come to an understanding about the issues our nation faces today. On October 6th, 1817, nearly 200 years ago, President James Monroe laid the cornerstone for Pavilion 7 at Jefferson's Academical Village in Charlottesville, UVA. Former Presidents James Madison and our own Thomas Jefferson also attended that ceremony. In 1820, Jefferson shared his vision for the university, and it was this. This institution will be based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind. For here we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, nor to tolerate any error so long as reason is left free to combat it. He also wrote in a letter to John Adams in 1813 that wisdom and duty dictate an humble resignation to the verdict of our peers. So it is in this spirit that we gather here tonight to discuss the topics of monuments and meaning. And I have one final Jefferson quotation to share with you, and it is a bit of the guiding principle of this discussion and this series. And that's every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. So with that, I want to thank a few people and then introduce our panelists for tonight. I want to thank Bill Knoll of the Donovan Media Center at Lynchburg College for recording tonight's program. Thanks to our sound engineer, Jeff Chenault. Thanks to a special student from EC Glass, 10th grader Patrick Ganaway, for all of his help, and all of my staff for being here. And of course, thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us in this magnificent spot. And one last piece of housekeeping. We have a reception following the discussion, and it'll be in the lower level of the house directly below you. And you can go through that door, and through that door, and there's a stair pavilion on either side, or out the front of the house and around to the rear. And we'll have the reception immediately following this. So now on to our speakers in no particular order. Joseph McGill is a descendant of slaves. He founded the Slave Dwelling Project to ensure the preservation of slave dwellings in the United States. For years, he worked at the National Trust for Historic Preservation in Charleston, South Carolina, by day, and spent his weekends as a Civil War reenactor wearing the uniform of the 54th Massachusetts. Reenacting the 54th helped draw public attention to the pivotal role of black soldiers in the Civil War. So in 2010, when the Magnolia Plantation near Charleston sought to publicize its restoration, the restoration of its neglected slave cabins, he proposed sleeping in one of them. And since then, he has spent nights in over 80 dwellings, including right here at Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest. Welcome, Joseph. Coulter Loth is a senior architectural historian of the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. He is co-president of the Center of Palladian Studies in America, a member of the Virginia State Art and Architecture Review Board, and a member of the board of the trustees of Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest. In 2008, he received the first Secretary of the Interior's Award for service to state preservation programs. His publications include the Virginia Landmarks Register and the Virginia Landmarks Black History. Welcome, Calder. Adam Dean, immediate to my left, is an associate professor of history at Lynchburg College. He's a BA from the University of California and his MA and PhD from the UVA. His focus of study is slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. And last week, he presented a lecture at Lynchburg College on monuments entitled The Past is Never Dead, the Confederate Monument Controversy in Historical Context. And I want to thank him personally for agreeing to be here tonight on such short notice. So thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
And finally, tonight's moderator, Edward L. Ayers, is a Tucker Boatwright Professor of Humanities and President Emeritus at the University of Richmond. Dr. Ayers has been named National Professor of the Year, received the National Humanities Medal from President Obama at the White House, was a finalist for the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize, and won the Bancroft Prize for Distinguished Writing in American History. Dr. Ayers is one of the co-hosts of the Backstory, a popular podcast about American history. In his newest book, The Thin Light of Freedom, the Civil War and Emancipation in the Heart of America, will be published this fall. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speakers, and I'll turn the microphone over to Dr. Ayers.
Well, it's great to see everybody, and we're all becoming intimate friends here very quickly, and we're looking forward to a really interesting discussion tonight. I want to kind of give you a brief perspective on my own role in all this, which is going to be mainly to be a provocateur. Whatever any of my friends up here say, I'll argue with, and what any of you say, I'll argue with. And that's partly because that's useful and fun for me, and also because I'm a member of the commission in Richmond to determine what we're going to do about Monument Avenue and with Confederate memorials in general. And I think it's appropriate for me to be out here holding forth, but what it is appropriate for me out here is learning from all of you. And that's what we're doing over the course of the fall. Many, many conversations and lots of different groups in which people have a chance to tell us what they think. And as you see from all the editorials, many people think many different things. I've heard many of them, and I can articulate them on demand. So that's what I will be doing tonight. Just a little bit about this. The timeline here starts in 2015, I think, with the shooting in Charleston is the most immediately precipitating event for the controversies over Confederate memorials. But historians have been talking about this for a long time. Obviously, art historians, architectural historians have been studying the monuments and their histories for a very long time. I think I first wrote about this 25 years ago, and when I was trying to explain how it was that suddenly monuments appeared all across the South, and how it was that traveling salesmen with Confederate monuments, short, tall, and taller, and clean-shaven and bearded, and all these that United Dogs of the Confederacy would be choosing from catalogs for all the courthouses across the South. Tonight, of course, we're talking about truly monumental works, including the first, the most dramatic installation of a Confederate memorial, the Robert Ely statue in Richmond, and the remarkably varied history of these monuments across space and time. So I just want to let anyone watching on the camera or later on film realize that I am playing the role of provocateur, not playing myself tonight in all of this. And I should say, too, that it's been remarkably instructive in Richmond for the hundreds of comments that we've received, many of which are very thoughtful, and often which are not really represented in public comments, in which people with very clearly held and perspectives argue against other people with very clearly held perspectives. And instead, there's lots of people thinking about how we might use this moment to move forward rather than just argue among ourselves. That said, I want us to argue among ourselves tonight in order to, the best way, and following Mr. Jefferson, the best way to see what we think is to try it out and hear what other people have to say in response. So I don't plan to hold forth. I hope this will be the longest I talk tonight. We'll see if I can adhere to that principle. Because I would like to hear from three other panelists. And I think I'm going to try to break things down into relatively specific questions that we can have relatively specific answers on rather than sort of holding forth about a philosophy that we have about one thing or another. So I guess I would begin with a question triggered by the exhibits around us. Do we think that 2015 is the beginning of the story that we're telling now? Is that a good place for us to begin? And I will take advantage of the fact that I was once Professor Dean's professor and therefore have authority to say. So what do you think, Adam?
No, I don't think, wow, that microphone is a little louder. I'm used to my professor voice. So I don't think that 2015 was the beginning about the debate over monuments and memory of the Civil War. I think that debate began right when the war ended. For my next book project, I'm studying white Southern Unionists during Reconstruction. I believe in May of 1865, a white Southern Unionist from New Orleans by the name of A.P. Dostie gave his talk, and his talk was about how we should remember this war that we've all just been through. And he said, well, should we erect monuments to Stonewall Jackson and Robert Ely, or will we create a new history in the U.S. South at the time? And all throughout the years, there's been a debate about what did the Civil War actually mean? What was its legacy? And in more modern times, in the late 1980s, there was a debate about the presence of a Parson Brownlow painting in Tennessee State Capitol that had been there since 1989. And some legislators thought that Parson Brownlow, who was a Southern Unionist, shouldn't belong there anymore, and removed him and kept a bust of Nathaniel Bedford Forrest in the state capitol. And certainly that didn't reflect the same level of debate that went on here, but it got picked up by the New York Times. And so I think this has been a very long debate that began right at the end of the war.
Well, as we see from what Travis has told us and from all of this newspaper stuff around here, this has been a very trying several months recently. And and I guess beginning in 1915, it opened up old wounds that I thought had been put to rest or should be put to rest a long time ago. And now we're feeling we can deal with the issues of hate and bigotry by tearing down statues. And I don't know what that accomplishes. Iconoclasm is a primitive form of protest. It's been going on for millennia. The early Christians defaced every Roman figure they could find because they were symbols of idolatry. The Puritans, during the Puritan Revolt in Britain in the 17th century, militant Puritans went around and smashed every stained glass window they could find because they were considered symbols of Catholic idolatry. Are we glad they did that? In this century, we see it going on right now, the 21st century. The Taliban have dynamited the colossal Buddhas of Bamiyan because they consider them contrary to Islam. That's a World Heritage Site. And the ISIS has mutilated or destroyed ancient statues of Hittite culture in Hatra, also a World Heritage Site. That's vandalism. Vandalism is people destroying what they can't or won't understand. And I would like to think that this country is more civilized than that we can rise above vandalism and try to learn from our past, try to learn from the monuments of history by not destroying them. They tell us lots of things. It's fascinating to me that many of the statues are doing exactly what they are supposed to do now, particularly the ones on Monument Avenue. They've opened up dialogue. They've created a deeper interest and understanding of history. It's what they're supposed to do. And now we're looking at these monuments simply as symbols of white supremacy or people being glorified who felt that slavery was the right thing to do. And actually, slavery, it's like a narcotic. A narcotic is very hard to give up. And the worst way to try to give it up is to quit cold turkey. It's almost impossible. But that's what many Southerners felt that they were being forced to do. And narcotic is a long and painful process. I'll quit the
So the answer to your question, though, is yes, 2015 was a turning point.
Yes.
Right? Okay. And we'll
If you want to put it that way, of course it was. Yeah.
Well, it's not obviously.
It did
that it was.
open up the wounds. It had been
framed
dormant
things
for a while.
about
certainly.
well, there have been protests for a very long time about the Confederate flag. Dylan Roof did not begin that, but culminated that in many ways. So I think that without all, and many people have said ever since the Civil Rights Movement, when the Confederate flag was used as a symbol of intransigence against the federal government, that the Confederate flag has been charged ever since. So I think that it's clearly a flashpoint for the current conversation. Adam says it begins in 1865. Collier says 2015, so we've got a good right span in there. Joseph, do you have a thought?
Oh yeah, got lots of those. 2015. I remember that night. I was taking my daughter to Clemson University, and that
Paid endorsement.
and that incident happened in the church in Charleston, South Carolina, and my wife got on her phone and started ringing the number of one of the victims, and all she got was a continuous ring, and the voicemail would kick in, and it never happened. So I knew some of those folks personally who died in that church that night, and Mother Emanuel that night. Now, it took that incident to make others realize that that symbol was an issue, because immediately after that, South Carolina removed that symbol from its ground. Well, in the year 2000, I was there when they removed that symbol from the top of the dome and placed it on the ground where it was. So that's another date that's important. 1961, when that Confederate flag was placed up there, the centennial of the Civil War, and that flag being placed there for that reason. But now, of course, we're here now to talk about monuments. Now, the thing about the difference between flag and monuments is that no one can wave a monument in my face, but they can wave a flag in my face. And so, we have to, the farther away that we got from that war, that Civil War, we have to investigate the intent of the people who put those statues in place. And when we evaluate their intent and have those conversations about their intent, I think that should be our answer as to what happens to that particular statue. So if you're looking for dates, I think we need to look at the time that those monuments were erected and deal with them in that place, in that time, have the discussion about that place and that time and the people who put them there.
That's a great answer. What do you think it was about 2015 that triggered the response? I mean, people have been pointing out that the flag to them was a symbol of hatred for a long time, but suddenly after the Charleston shooting, flags began coming down in many places. What do you think changed in the time in between?
I think it was Dylan Roof himself and his manifesto and all that was contained therein, and all the symbols that it was dotted with that called for that immediate change.
Folks have thoughts about what it was about 2015 that did accelerate the conversation that we're having now?
I'd agree. I think Dylan Roof's massacre of people at the Charleston church really did reignite the modern debate.
So, we think of this in two ways. One, there's the stone that goes into the water, and then there's the water. How had the water changed by 2015 that people were so ready to move? Because, as you're pointing out, people had tried to, had in fact removed the flag before. And I was a consultant at University of Mississippi. They were talking about these things before Dylan Roof and what are you supposed to do and all that. So we can agree that innocent people being massacred in their own church is a particularly horrific instance, and the sort of manifesto that Roof wrote. But it also doesn't really explain why things were so quick to move after, or maybe it does. Maybe the enormity of the event was so shocking that it created space for something to happen. But anybody has a thought about that?
Well, I think,
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah, it was such a horrendous event that people felt they had to do something to show their disgust against this. And yes, Confederate flag flying over the South Carolina state capitol was an in-your-face thing, and I think a lot of people legitimately took it as a symbol of white supremacy, and that was an easy thing to do. And that led to the next thing. Well, while we're at it, let's just go ahead and deal with all these Confederate monuments. And the people went on this hysteric parade of political correctness that we got to do something.
Not too uncertain about what your position on these things are, but you know,
But it's just like the massacre that happened the day before yesterday in Las Vegas. We got to do something, but that's a much more difficult thing to do. Getting rid of guns. We've been trying to deal with getting rid of guns for decades. Nothing happens because it's a very difficult thing to do. Removing flags is easy. Tearing down statues is easy. And they think, okay, we've done something, therefore, okay, we've shown that we're against this. But what, as I say, with iconoclasm, what is the long-term effect of that?
well, that's one thing. We'll talk about that. So let's focus for a second on, or as many seconds as you want, the difference between flags and monuments. They can't be waved, and they're harder to take down. They are not standing over a public place like a state capitol. So there are those. But are there crucial differences between a flag and a monument that should frame our discussion, other than the fact that monuments are harder to remove, which is why they're there? They were built to be hard to remove. That's what monuments are. So monuments and flags. Thoughts?
Yeah, well, flags. I don't like the people who were waving the flags, for one thing. You know, KKK and the neo-Nazis have determined themselves to be the protectors of Confederate legacy. I don't want to be associated with those people, and I'm sorry that they've hijacked this part of our history.
Well, that's certainly one effect of Charlottesville, I think. But I've lived for 37 years, so it's weird to have the place where you live become an event. I hear myself say after Charlottesville, even though it's my home. Certainly when those neo-Nazis were mingling the Confederate flag with the Nazis' flags, it changed the conversation about the flags as well. Adam, Joseph, thoughts about flags and monuments?
Yeah. When we talk about monuments, we're talking more something that affects the landscape more boldly, I think, than a flag. Although I've seen some huge flags flying down 95, but that's another story.
Vandalized last night, by the way.
Oh, yeah? Huh, interesting. The monuments, we're talking about the landscape. We're talking about visual, something tangible, something that someone can look at and have a conversation about, something that if the narrative is changed on that particular monument, if indeed these monuments are vetted in a sense that if we know exactly why that person was placed there, that information is pretty much readily available. But then we need to vet it differently. We need to find out, was that individual a slave owner? If you search his DNA, will you find someone who looks like me? What did that person do to hinder the pursuit of happiness of those recently freed people? And if you vet them in that manner, they may come up clean. I don't think Nathan Bedford Forrest would come up clean, but there are other elements or other individuals of that movement, that Confederate movement, who would. And if indeed they do, then leave them right there. But correct that narrative at that place where these monuments stands. And monuments, you can do that with monuments, and I think you should.
I think that monuments are about political power. They were about political power when they came up in the 1890s, early 1900s, 1920s. And I think this modern debate is less about political correctness, which no one's ever been able to properly define for me what exactly that means, but about the very meaning of the war. Why did the war happen? Why did Reconstruction turn out the way that it did? And as the dynamics of political power have changed in the United States, so have the debates about what exists in the public domain.
So you would think that the current debate is predictable in general, if not in particular.
Yes.
As finally African Americans have some say of political power, it's not surprising they would say we're questioning these statues that were put up under a different regime.
Yes.
Right? So let me challenge you a little bit, Joseph, and to suggest that there are that some of the Confederates might come out clean. Okay. No matter their character, no matter their wartime behavior, no matter even their post-war behavior, they were fighting to create a new nation separate from the United States that would be explicitly built on perpetual bondage. How could any of them have a clean bill of health, given that that is what the purpose of the war they were fighting was defined?
They'll have a clean bill of health just as the soldiers who fought the Vietnam War, when they came back and all the hell that they caught from we as individuals who gave them that hell. Those were soldiers. They don't start wars, they fight wars. Confederate soldiers were soldiers. They don't start wars, they fight wars. So why should I condemn a descendant of those Confederates just because their ancestors fought for that cause? I mean, this is modern day. I shouldn't hold that against them. So I think that, you know, this is our opportunity to separate those things. Again, I think the closer those statues were placed there, as close to that Civil War as possible, I think those will be fine. But the farther we move away from that war, and we getting individuals putting up these wars, you know, kind of in your face type, you know, to project white supremacy, then that's a different story. Then they need to be looked at as such.
That was a really good answer, so let me push you a little bit on it. Common soldiers, you're right, have nothing to do about determining the purposes for which they're fighting. But Robert Ely, a close confidant of Jefferson Davis and a participant in the debates about whether the Confederacy should employ African-American men to fight for the Confederacy and so forth, it would seem that Anne, someone who forswore his oath to the United States, you'd be willing to say, to use your argument about Vietnam analogy for Robert Ely?
Yeah, yes, I would. Because if we condemn Robert E. Lee for what he did, and he has been being condemned for that, then we also got to condemn his father and the father before him, because they were defending a way of life that was passed down to them. So why should we stop there with them, removing their monuments? But didn't they have a father, and then they have a father, and then they passed down that way of life to them?
That's kind of, just one second, I'll hand it back to you. It's kind of like extending this monument, this debate to cover the entire world and all of human history too, right? Okay, let's focus on the immediate thing before us. And I find that the people who are talking about where's this going to end are people who are opposed to doing anything about the Confederacy. These are not, by and large, the people who are talking about doing something about the Confederacy now is going to knock down George Washington, right? So that by and large, in the hundreds of conversations that I've had, it tends to be people who want to use that as the logical outgrowth of political correctness, is that you'd have to take down all of them. It was Robert E. Lee who made the decision that he made. This has nothing to do with his father, okay? And so forget his father, okay? He made the decision that he made. We don't hold him accountable before we build the monument for him. Let me just point out, I'm arguing with what anybody says. So this is what it sounds like to do this, right?
So yeah, Robert E. Lee made that decision, but he had he was impacted by other things to make that decision. Again, it was still, the DNA was there. When you get into white supremacy, you don't stop white supremacy at the Confederates.
We'll return to that.
But you go back to where it started. You have to go back. You have to go back to where this nation started, and it was based on that, so we cannot stop there at the Confederates.
Yeah,
We
only
can't
some
make it
people
there.
were trying to dismantle the United States and other people were not. There's a big distinction between what was there at the founding and what not happened. Adam, you wanted to say something? Calder, I'll give you a chance.
Yeah, I've been a bit disappointed how this whole conversation, not referring to tonight at all,
is
but
awesome.
I meant what we're seeing around us without looking at primary sources. So primary sources are the tools that historians use to practice their craft. It's what I emphasized during my teaching at Lynchburg College. And the Confederates themselves saw their activities as very different in ways than the founding generation. Alexander Stephens gave a speech to the Georgia legislature in 1861. I had to bring up Thomas Jefferson because we're here at Poplar Forest, but he expressly rejected Jefferson's views on equality and freedom, and he rejected Jefferson's anguish over the issue of slavery in defense of a new moral certainty that slavery is right, it's ordained by God, and it is the natural position for black people. And so this notion that Confederate monuments are the exact same as Jefferson monuments and monuments to George Washington is just really not the case, and they themselves viewed that legacy differently.
I would only add to that that the phrase that Vice President of the Confederacy used was that Negro slavery is the cornerstone of our new nation, the cornerstone of it, and that the Constitution of the Confederacy was altered from that of the United States only to extend the term of the president to 6 years, but also to frankly acknowledge the slavery by name in a way that the United States Constitution did not. So if you go back, and one of the things that we did at UR, Virginia wrestled with secession far more than we acknowledge. For months, they could not determine what to do. And the delegates who were sent from all 152 counties, we were a bigger place then, to Richmond to debate this, most of them were sent there to save the United States. And it was the course of events that pulled them into secession. And so I think that we built a database or a website about all the debates they had, and you can search it, and I do this one search, and I show that people talk about its economics. And the tariff is mentioned 81 times. Slavery is mentioned 1,432 times. So this idea that it had nothing to do with slavery and with states' rights, as Adam says, is just not borne out by the historical record. And so often I find that the very brief letters in the Times, not letters, the notes, the dismissive comments that so often follow some of these articles are, people need to study their history, know what they're talking about. I find that they very seldom do. And what studying history would actually involve would be looking at the documents of what people said themselves. That doesn't completely contradict the point of where do we draw the line. I often have people come to me and say, well, the Civil War couldn't have been about slavery. 3/4 of white Southerners didn't own slaves. And so if we imagine that people are calculating their interest before they sign up, but the fact is that over 90% of all military-age Southern white men fought for the Confederacy. So the point is that it was basically everybody, and it wasn't, you weren't really, at a certain point, really choosing to do it. So it's something that enveloped the entire South. It's not entirely, except for Lee at the beginning of the war and other generals who had been with the United States military for their entire careers. They did have moments to decide. They were not, and there were generals from Virginia who chose to remain loyal to the United States. So it was not just because they loved their home, or that it was natural, or it was a way of life, or any of those easy answers that we have. These were very intelligent men who looked this decision square in the face and decided they would go to war against the United States. So those are the things that we would, as we sort of put the historical record out there and just think about what it is we're actually talking about, is a way to begin. That doesn't mean that you can't think whatever you want to think about the statues, but I think the things that I'm telling you are just historically documented fact. Calder, I said you could talk a bit, I kept talking.
Well, I take exception to the fact, and I can speak on a bit on Monument Avenue. I live a couple of blocks from there, and I used to be on a Monument Avenue commission in the 1970s, and we dealt with a lot of issues about Monument Avenue. But I take exception to the fact that they are primarily symbols of white supremacy. I don't think that was the primary motive for them being erected.
That's a great point. So we're taking history apart to its different moments, okay? So we talked about the moment of decision of the men that the statues monumentalize. But the other big decision is, okay, well, they were dead. They didn't build these statues to themselves. Who did and when? And for what purpose? And I think you're right, Calder. That is, as Adam was saying at the beginning, this is what the big debates are about, the motivations behind the people who put them up. And you do see that some people are saying they had nothing to do with slavery, and other people saying it was all about white supremacy. Tonight, we're going to come up with clearer answers to that than this kind of dichotomy. So who would like to start helping us unravel that? Maybe a sense of chronology would be helpful. The first monuments to the Civil War were in cemeteries and put up by the widows and daughters of Confederate soldiers. This new book that I have coming out in a few weeks, a lot of it's about the Shenandoah Valley, and it's about the battle here in Lynchburg as well. And I see how in 1865 they start having poetry about Stonewall Jackson, and they start strewing the flowers with graves, the graves with flowers, and they have, you folks know Stanton, you imagine a 2-mile-long parade or procession through the city to the cemetery. Okay? So memorializing the fallen soldiers of the Confederacy, as of the United States, begins instantly. To my mind, I'd be curious what Calder thinks about this. I'd be curious what everybody thinks about this. The most powerful Confederate memorial, I think, is the giant pyramid of rough-hewn stone from the James River in Hollywood Cemetery, which went up in 1868. Surrounded by 18,000 graves of young men from all over the South who came to Richmond to die. Okay? And all it is this enormous pyramid that bespeaks grief. So that's 1868. It's not until 1890 that you have the enormous statue of Robert Ely, made in France, shipped across the ocean, pulled by 10,000 people, the stories say, by rope up from the James to its place where it sits now, which was at the time an empty field and a projected real estate development, which became Monument Avenue. Okay? It was designed from the outset to be about developing the city and creating what it became. At the same time that those 10,000 people aren't pulling that rope for real estate development, there's real devotion to Robert E. Lee there. So to understand this, we can't trivialize anybody's motives at the time. Okay, so that's a kind of a premise, I would say. So let's focus, if we can, on the 1890 Robert E. Lee statue, which is owned by the state of Virginia, and whatever Monument Avenue Commission has nothing to do with that in terms of power. Recommendations can be made, whatever. But so that is a unique monument, and the others followed after that. So maybe we could talk about the 1890. Calder, you'd had the last comment about saying that we have to have a more complex understanding of people's motivations, so maybe you'd like to tell us what this is.
Well, now we're trying to make all the monuments to be symbols of white supremacy, objects of bigotry.
Let's just talk about the League. Let's just talk about
I'm going to talk about the League.
Okay, well, I'm not
Let me talk about the League.
Okay.
So putting yourself back in the context of the times, this was primarily an action by the people who had survived the Civil War, the widows, the veterans particularly. Look what they had gone through. They had participated in a horrible war, which they were probably largely responsible for. They had witnessed suffered the humiliation of defeat. They had lost 200,000 of their people. In war, they had suffered the humiliation of occupation and reconstruction. I guess they felt a certain amount of guilt of having participated in this. They had seen their economy wrecked, lifestyles destroyed. How else could they deal with what had happened? They had to do something. And I think these Confederate monuments, or particularly the Lee Monument more than any, was seen as a symbol of recuperation. Not so much white supremacy. I don't doubt that motives of white supremacy may have existed at the time, but I really don't think that was the primary motive for putting up that statue. And as a matter of fact, I think the Star-Spangled Banner was played as part of that ceremony. They had to have a hero because of the awful thing that they'd gone through. And we've put this label of white supremacy and bigotry on the statues since that time.
The 1890 Lee? Well, I think it needs to stay right there. I don't mind being reminded of Lee and all that he did. Lee did good things for the Confederacy. If you're thinking militarily, till the end, of course. So I don't mind being reminded of that. You know, I want to go someday and spend the night in those places where Jefferson Davis laid his head, because I want to, you know, I want to be able to immerse myself in that. I want to be able to learn about these people who were worthy enough to be placed on a monument. But I want the whole story. I don't want the good stuff. I want it all. I want all those things that meant something to the folks who possess my DNA. I want to know how did his actions affect them? All that needs to be incorporated into the story.
I think we have to look at the context. I agree with Calder. This can't be simplified into good guys and bad guys and white supremacists and heroes. But 1890 was also the year of the disenfranchisement Constitution. Decade later, sorry. 1890 saw a wave of state constitutions that disenfranchised African Americans throughout the South. And one of the really good lessons that I learned when I was in college, first at UCLA, is a historian named the name of Joan Waugh, who's an excellent Civil War historian, said, "A good historian looks for what is not there." And so what is not on Monument Avenue? For one, there's some Confederates. So James Longstreet, in a purely military sense, anyone who knows anything about the Army of Northern Virginia knows that he's a pretty big deal. Yet there's no monument to James Longstreet throughout the South. Why? Because in Reconstruction, he became a Republican and dared to question some of Lee's decisions, particularly Pickett's charge. And for both of those things, his war record was smeared, particularly by Lynchburger Jubal Early. And there were no monuments to the black congressman from Virginia during Reconstruction. And so, you know, it's not as cut as dry as white supremacy, but these monuments were about political power at the time.
Well, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
We've been talking about white supremacy. Let's figure out what it is that we're talking about when we say that. I will begin by saying it's hard for me to imagine any white Americans in the 19th century who would not be racist by our own standards. Not that we're so much better than they are. That's one thing that has changed, and that was just sort of written into the way that people saw things, except abolitionists, who were only 2% of the northern population. So it gives you some idea what they would have been in the entire American population. Right? So does it mean anything to say white supremacy in 1890? What if that's not a word they used? Adam, you talked about primary documents, and we were talking before, it matters what people said. If they didn't use the word white supremacy, should we be using it to describe their motives?
I think so. I think so because 1787 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, when that document was penned, we the people. You know, if you were female, if you looked like me, that we the people was even when they penned the word, it was false. So I think those men were exercising that privilege right then and there. So it carries forward.
It's white supremacy by another name. That's what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay. Gentlemen, you want to say anything about that?
I think that it's worth using as a descriptive term, but I'm going to use your own words that you taught me as a graduate student at the University of Virginia, is that it's not enough, that there's a whole gray area of opinion that people use, and it always amazes me when one of my students comes to the conclusion that Lincoln was racist, because of course by our standards he was profoundly racist. Yet his election in 1860 as a moderate anti-slavery candidate precipitated secession. And so it is a useful label as long as you describe the gradients therein within the 19th century and actually describe what people's views are.
You want to say anything, Father?
I can't argue with you all. Y'all are Civil War historians, far more involved with all of this than I've ever been. I do want to speak to Monument Avenue if I can, because that's something that's right at the apex of this debate right now, what to do about that. People say, and I think that's a facile thing to say, that the monuments need to be taken down and put in a museum. That's where they belong. I maintain that Monument Avenue is a museum. It is a unique open-air museum, a synthesis of sculpture, architecture, city planning. To remove the monuments would be disfiguring, mutilating a very important historic landmark. Monument Avenue is a National Historic Landmark designated in 1997, meaning that it has cultural and historic importance to the entire nation. I can appreciate that black citizens find Monument Avenue's monuments offensive. I can certainly understand that, but I find even far more offensive my city's incessant murders, its crime, its drug trafficking, its rotten schools, its hungry children. That's where we should focus our attention. If we want reconciliation, that's the kind of reconciliation that we should bring about. Tearing down monuments does not do that. I'm not finished. Leaving those monuments up, we have to consider them. If we consider it a museum, then those are works of art that belong in a museum. It is a museum. Also, if we consider Monument Avenue to be a museum, then those are museum artifacts. Museum artifacts, by their very nature, need to be interpreted in order to be understood. You don't destroy them. I find most modern art offensive, but that doesn't mean it should be destroyed. It needs to be interpreted. That's what museums do, and that's what should happen and can happen with Monument Avenue. We need to understand these things. These are important relics of our history. They tell us a lot about it, and we have seen from all of this information that a lot is to be learned about it, and a lot has been learned about it. And I hope it will continue to be learned about it. But well, you can't take down the Lee statue and put it in a museum. That's impossible. That's a stupid idea. And I also maintain that probably the most important monument on Monument Avenue is the Jefferson Davis Monument, because that signals more than anything else a very important historic fact, and that was Richmond being the capital of the Confederacy. And he was the president of the Confederacy, and that is a fact that we have to live with. If we want to consider that our scarlet letter, then so be it. It's a fact that we have to deal with in perpetuity.
Yeah, it's kind of like our desire to take the N-word out of Huckleberry Finn, as if it never happened. I'm with you on this. You know, the monuments where they are is that opportunity for us to, yeah, we were this, and then some people's opinion, this was not good, and other people's opinion, this was good, but at least we can have that conversation.
We're talking as if these statues are being interpreted, and they are not. They're just standing there without any interpretation. So when I was invited to join the mayor's commission, the whole idea was that we would do just what you folks are talking about. It is not now, okay? The statues say nothing other than this was an important man, okay? And so when we first began the commission, we had the big meeting in Richmond, 500 people showed up, and some people who objected to the idea of thinking about this at all had signs that I think are important for us to remember. No context, no compromise. They didn't want any context. They said to explaining just exactly what you're talking about and what you're talking about too, of where these statues came from, who put them up, why, for what purpose, what people said at the time, and this is a quote, was vile. Okay? So suddenly, after Charlottesville, so-called contextualizing the statues, as you would in a museum, unlike what they are now seems like a moderate position. Before Charlottesville, it was seen as an extreme position, a violation of the artistic integrity of these works of art by explaining their origins. So I just want to point out how these things are shifting and how quickly things have shifted to the idea of, yes, let's explain them, what people's motivations were when they put them up. When you see what those look like, it's not going to quieten all the controversy because people were very explicit about why they were putting up, both for their love of their fathers who had fought and died, and also a symbol to the North that we may have lost the war, but we have not been vanquished in our spirit. And John Mitchell, a city councilman at the time in Richmond, the monument goes up and says, "What? This is a monument to treason." So this is not political correctness applied by the 21st century to the 19th. It's a continuation of a conflict that began in the 19th century in different forms. So I would just want to point out that I believe that we are making progress, that this is a good thing. So I have all these journalists call me. This is before Charlottesville, which changes everything. But before that, isn't it terrible that we're arguing about this? And the answer is no, it's not. It's good that we're talking about the meaning of the flag and the monuments as long as we trust democracy. Now, this is an important thing to point out. This is all being done through the courts, and through the political process, through open meetings, through all these things. It's not being done by people coming in with sledgehammers unless all of that process is not. This is what it's supposed to look like. That people would come out of their own free will to participate in these conversations, to inform the conversation, and that these decisions will be made by publicly elected officials who are accountable to the electorate. So that's an important thing for us to understand. This isn't just some people behind a screen who are determining this, and it's not protesters in the street. It's going to come back to elected officials. This has gone by so rapidly that I want to make sure, I think it's been an hour, and so I think it's good that we open for your questions and comments, if that seems okay. Any of you have anything you'd like to say before we do that?
I'd just like to add one thing. I gave a talk at Lynchburg College on the history of Confederate monuments, and 190 people came. It was standing room only. And yes, some professors gave students extra credit, but that was only about 25 students out of the 190. And certainly there's plenty of important issues to discuss in society, but simply because people want to discuss the history of Confederate monuments and the legacy of the Civil War, that makes me excited as a historian. I'm not forcing those 190 people to come hear me talk, right? And when every other history talk that we've given, it's about 25 people showing up, right? And so just because there's other important societal dilemmas to deal with doesn't mean that we shouldn't be talking about this.
Or that this is a substitute for dealing with the other issues.
Yeah.
Yes, so either you gentlemen before, I see a hand already, so that's a good sign. But if you'd like to say something, make sure that you got a chance to.
All I want to say, if it comes to contextualizing or interpreting the statutes, I'll be glad to work with you
Great.
on the text, all right?
Right. And, you know, the word contextualizing, which suddenly appeared over the last couple of years, all it really means is explaining. And so I think that it sounds like it's going to be something more either ornate or onerous or useless, but instead it's just like, hey, here's the story of these monuments. So I think it's important that there's been sort of a recognition of people across a broad range that is helpful. There are some people on one end who think that's a violation of them. There's other people on the other end who think it's a terrible substitute for actually taking them down. But that leaves a whole lot of people who think, I wish I knew what these statues meant, what they were meant to mean, what they mean now, what they might mean in the future. Joe, do you have something you'd like to say before we take questions? Okay, great. Yes, sir.
I just find the whole timing here interesting. You know, you'd mentioned the pyramid, the rough stone pyramid in Hollywood Cemetery,
Yeah.
which I'm going to go see. I think that sounds fantastic. And you said it's not the second most moving statue; it's the most moving one that you know of anywhere. And my guess is, in all these articles, it's not mentioned once. It's not mentioned once. And why? What was it? It was definitely a memorial to the fallen dead after the Civil War. And if you look at timing, if you go to England and you look after World War I, there were all these statues. There weren't new statues built 25 years later. The same thing is true with when John F. Kennedy was killed. There were statues. There weren't new statues 25 years later. 9/11, we have a beautiful new memorial in New York. 25 years from now, they aren't going to be. And I just think it's sort of interesting what's the context that made it go from a relatively small number of monuments to all of a sudden there was this, I think, a very large increase in the monuments in the sort of 1890 to 1920 period.
They didn't have the money to do it then. It took a long time to raise enough money to
No,
do
but it
something
hasn't
like that.
happened any other time, in any other war. I mean,
I actually would disagree with that. So I don't think it was an issue of the money. Good friends, good colleague of mine, Carolyn Janey, did a great book on the Ladies Memorial Associations in Richmond after the war, and they were quite adept at raising money. I think one thing that people aren't talking about is all the northern Civil War monuments were erected in the late 1800s and early 1900s as well. And some of them are anti-lost cause monuments. And they're in small towns throughout the Midwest and New England. And I think something that people aren't talking about is this is when Father Time was catching up with the Civil War generation. Just like there's a lot of World War II monuments being made now, because that's when that generation is passing away. And so I think there are plenty of war monuments being built as the generation that fought the war died. And that was an element in Civil War monuments, both northern and southern as well.
Let me pick up on that. You said northern states erecting monuments
Yes.
As a result of the Civil War. Well, northern states, they didn't say anything about their complicity, because when the northern states abolished slavery legislatively shortly after the Revolution, they were still owning the banks, they were still owning the finance companies, they were building the ships, they had the factories where they were adding value to the cotton that was being picked. So their complicity was all over that war, all over that institution, excuse me. And, there's nothing out there that, how do we memorialize that? I mean, we could see a statue to the Confederates But how do we put a statue up? Or how do we figure out that complicity that went on by those, those northern states?
It's a great point. All these are excellent points. I don't know that numerically, Adam, were there more statues in the North than in the South? I don't know.
I can't tell you that
Yeah.
off the top of my head.
But here's what we do know, is that those statues, too, simplified the Northern and purified the Northern purpose in the same way that the Confederate monuments do, because that's what monuments do, right? That they are meant to be memorials to the best. And so one thing I point out is Abraham Lincoln got the same percentage of votes in 1864 in the North that he got in 1860. Nearly half of white Northern men would not support Abraham Lincoln, even in 1864. We don't see monuments to the Northern Democrats who refused to support Lincoln at the moment of crisis because, in large part, he had turned the war into a war against slavery. Where are the monuments to the 4 million people held in slavery in this country for 2.5 centuries? Where are they? I don't know, how many monuments are there to the USCT? Obviously, the famous one in Boston. How many?
There are some. On Natchez, Mississippi, you can go find one, but you could probably count them on maybe 2 hands.
200,000 African American men who fight to save the United States, and we don't have many of those monuments. So I'd agree that the timing is the crucial thing for us to think about, and it does correspond, as Adam said before, with the big wave of every southern state passed new constitutions between 1890 and 1908 that disfranchised black voters. Okay? That is also when segregation began at the same time. This is the base that people would look at to say that it's white supremacy. It's also the case that the North doing it at the same time because the men that they revere are dying. That kind of gives you a sense of what it is that we're wrestling with.
I wonder what percent of Americans are aware, I certainly wasn't even aware that
Yeah, well, that's something we could talk a little bit later because you have a statue in Lynchburg about a key player in that.
That's called
Okay.
Jim Crow laws.
Yeah. So, I'm happy to.
Since we're in Lynchburg, I would like to talk a little bit about Lynchburg's monument. I am a United Daughter of the Confederacy for over 40 years and had 18 ancestors who fought for the Confederacy. I had 2 Northern ancestors who did not fight for the North. I don't know what they did, but they never fought. Anyway, the movement to start a monument in Lynchburg was started by the United Confederate Veterans. They were dying out. They wanted a monument to their fellow soldiers from the Lynchburg, Campbell County area. So they started raising money, and they were, as I said, dying out and elderly, so they asked the daughters to help them raise the money. At that time, there were 2 UDC chapters in Lynchburg. They took that as a project, finished the money, and it was I guess you would say a one statue that was original. It was not out of a catalog. It was sculpted and made in Bavaria and shipped over here. That's another argument against getting rid of monuments. We're doing away with fine art if we get rid of monuments. But anyway, to get back to Lynchburg.
So what year are we in at this point? What year are you talking about?
It was dedicated in May of 1900. The main speaker of the day was John Warwick Daniel, who was a person who really voted for that new Constitution that you've been mentioning. He was a very big mover in Richmond at that time. But anyway, back to the story. He talked so long that they had to close the program down. They didn't even get to finish it because he talked for almost 2 hours, which I won't do tonight. But that monument is one of a kind. It's a piece of art. It memorializes the men from Lynchburg and Campbell County who fought, whether they lost their lives or not. And from my own experience with letters from my great-great-grandfather Brooks, he was fighting for his home. It's in writing. He was not fighting to save slavery because he had no slaves. Only a couple of my ancestors did have slaves. One of them was kicked out of his father's will because he had 1 slave.
So, a couple things about that. Thank you very much. It's my belief that what will happen, what should happen, is that every community is going to have this conversation for itself. And I think that's the way it should be, and that's going to be the democratic purpose of all this. Each place discuss. What do we do with the Jubal Early statue, the John Daniel statue, and the one you're referring to? The United Daughters of the Confederacy were the prime movers in all this, and you read their records, and it's very clear that this is for veneration of their family members. Okay, so there's no doubt about that. So, but I think that we talk about Confederate monuments. You think how different Charlottesville, Lynchburg, and Richmond are in the monuments that they have, when they were put up, and by whom. So I'm afraid this is going to be with us for a long time, as each community is going to have to wrestle with, not necessarily taking them down. That's a binary that I think it distorts the discussion. I think that the question is, how do we explain these monuments that have been among us all these times, but have kind of fallen silent to people who weren't there at the moment, who don't remember a 2-hour speech. So, but I think you folks will get to wrestle with that. That's something to look forward to. I saw another hand here. Yes, sir.
We're talking about the Civil War primarily, and of course slavery. I'm going to start way early, but let me give you the final thought. You can tear down once, but resurrect is kind of difficult. So let's not destroy anything. Let's put a plaque on every historical monument explaining the reason. And of course on the bottom we say, we now are free. Now that's the conclusion. And we start in the beginning. Slavery has been around for a real long time, and most of us probably have slaves in our ancestry. So the thing is not slavery. The thing, or the issue, is we freed the slaves, and it was diverse. You had Irish, you had Africans. Africans had white slaves. So slavery should not be addressed. That was just the normal thing. What needs to be addressed is slaves are free. Now there's something else that needs to be addressed. The Republicans did a great job eliminating slavery. But when I say great, they also messed up greatly. To eliminate slavery is real simple. You look in the North, you see that they're mechanizing, it's more efficient. Slavery just doesn't pay. When you watch how they used hemp, how they broke hemp, well, boy, it took a man 2 minutes to make a hemp crusher, and if he had thought 5 minutes more, he could have produced 100 times more. So to eliminate slavery the right way is show that it doesn't work. And now, once you go in there and you just say, okay, you do this, then of course you have opposition. And you stirred up so many minds that for 150 years you have nothing but opposition. You had the Jim Crow laws, you had the White Sheet Society, and then you had a great opposition to the civil rights laws. The civil rights laws were designed to ameliorate all those effects of the opposition. Now, we are working in a much more subdued way now. For the first 100 years it was quite clear. White sheets, Jim Crow laws, all those were straightforward. They were against Negroes. That was totally clear. But what they're doing now is they're just doing it real subtle. Like, you make quotas. You may not punish or correct any kid in school more, a black kid more than a white kid. So at the middle of the school year, the black kids have their quota fulfilled. They can do anything they want. Now, how does that help? That never helps. So it was nice that we introduced civil rights legislation, but there needs to be a sunset. At one point, we have to help in a way that means something, that brings us someplace. And to repeat what I said before, let's have plaques saying we are now free, and what you're looking at is history.
I'd say Richmond, this important thing to remember, is putting up one of the first monuments to emancipation in the United States on Browns Island. And early 2019, you will see that. It's remarkable. There's no national holiday to commemorate the most important thing that ever happened in this country, which is the end of perpetual bondage for 4 million people. And there is not a national monument to emancipation. So it's interesting, if you were coming from Mars and looking at our history and thinking about the centrality of slavery, you would, and if freedom is the defining moment in which America really becomes itself, we don't seem to talk about it very much. I would just, as we think about the memorials. Yes, Ken. Very clever to get in the most remote corner there.
This question first is based on a little bit of ignorance. I have not been to Richmond in many years and haven't driven down Monument Avenue in 20 years or something. If we contextualize all the monuments, my memory is it's a 2-lane road and pedestrians are not going to be able to get over there to read them. So beyond making all of us happy, is there really a point? Yeah. If people can't read it and understand it?
It can be done. People walk in the median all the time. They're taking photographs of the statues. I saw them yesterday and today. It is a very important tourist venue there. And I want to talk about this with you later, but matter of fact, I had discussion about a proper venue for contextualizing, for interpretation, and I think that it might be a very promising solution.
One of the things the Commission is going to do is have conversations with the arts community and the preservation community so that we can bring that expertise to bear. So we very much want to hear it. I would say that you could have interpretive panels along the sidewalks that don't involve getting into the median anyway. It is a real problem with the Lee statue. You can't get anywhere near the Lee statue, right? So you'd have to have it on the sidewalks looking across that. The problem is, of course, is that when these were put up, this is pre-automobile, by and large, for the Lee statue in general. And now they are obstacles to automobile traffic and people aren't there to see them. Monument Avenue, though, has enormous amount of pedestrian traffic and the Easter parade and all these kinds of things. So there would be opportunities for that. But it's not simple to answer your question about where it should be or what they should say. I mean, that's one thing. I don't want to just act like, hey, contextualization, we got that figured out. Every word of every sign will require great care to tell the truth and to be useful to the civic purpose that we have in mind.
And then I think I just have to add this. I think we already have an example of contextualization done wrong in New Orleans. There is a monument called the Battle of Liberty Place Monument put up in 1884, and it was to the violent overthrow of Reconstruction, the biracial government in the South. And on the monument itself, it says, this is when our city restored white supremacy. That was the original context of the monument. In the early 1990s, before 2015, the city decided to cover that over with the phrase that both people, I think it said something to the effect of, people died here on both sides and we can learn from history. That's not how you contextualize.
Speaking of New Orleans, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And that's one reason that statue was taken down. That was one of the ones that New Orleans took down along with the Lee statue.
Speaking of New Orleans and taking out monuments, how can New Orleans take down the monuments that they did and leave Andrew Jackson? Now, we talk about the sins of this nation. We know slavery was one. But what about what we did to the Native Americans? I'm done. I'm finished.
Other questions? We have the microphone around. Okay. So, I don't know, do you know the specific
I don't
answer
know
to
the
that?
specifics to Shiloh, I'm sorry.
So I can say this, there's been a remarkable effort, and this is actually maybe a good place for us to end, because I think that it reminds us of what good work has been done about preservation of battlefields and sites, being done through philanthropy, being done by the people who have descendants from the North and the South, African Americans. Millions of acres have been preserved to save those, including around Richmond and including in the valley. And it shows that people can work together to commemorate things that need to be remembered, that can interpret. You go there and you see what the Park Service has done with the signs. They're curating, they're contextualizing just pieces of land and making them meaningful and powerful, right? So it's not as if we don't know how to do this. It's not as if we don't have professionals who do this for a living, who know how to preserve these works of art and how to interpret them. It is a question of us working through it and thinking what it is that we value. How do we make ourselves stronger as a country? How do we preserve what's worth preserving from the past as we lay the foundation for a better country to follow? How do we use this moment to actually address issues of inequality and injustice in the schools and so forth? I don't think that, some people talk about it would be very expensive to remove the monuments. Baltimore, it was $20,000, right? So but do we think removing them in the dead of night is the right way of going about this, right? So in all these things, I think we simply can't short circuit the conversation. There's no way through this except through it. And what we need to remember is that the country's faced harder times than this and tougher problems than this. And if we bring goodwill and honesty and listen to what each other has to say, that we can make progress on this and we'll be better as a result.